are seaweeds, and some of them are quite large.
One nice seaweed. It's a green and it's called Alameda. Now, the green chlorophyll in there fixes the energy of the sun and helps the seaweed to grow. But this one is rather peculiar because as it grows, it almost fossilises itself because it lays down limestone in its tissues. And it really does look like a sort of a semi-fossil prickly pear cactus. Now, seaweeds this size and just a little bigger aren't uncommon along the reef front. And of course, when they die, their calcareous chalky substance will help to add to the reef. But there are other seaweeds, much smaller, which are of much more importance.
Living inside the bulk of the coral-forming animals are minute seaweeds, each one too small to be seen with the naked eye, but each one capable of turning sunlight into chemical energy and producing oxygen as a byproduct. And each one helps the animals inside which they live to build its rocky skeleton. So much so that take away the tiny plants and the majority of the coral animals can no longer form coral rock. No reef rock means no barrier to erosion and no home for all the fish and all the other members of the reef community.
So you see, when it comes to the life of the reef, the seaweed just couldn't be more important, and nowhere more so than here on the reef ridge itself. Now, the bulk of the reef-forming corals can't grow above high water mark, but in the bad storms, many of the eroded lumps of coral block get washed up on here and pile along to form this protective barrier. Now, of course, they'd soon get washed away, but for the fact, immediately they're plonked down here, seaweeds start to grow, a thin film, green, brown, but mainly reds, a living veneer covering the surface of the rock and helping to bind it together. And of course, as they're plants, if a bit does get knocked out, they'll soon go back protecting the rock. And as a by-product of their life processes, they produce oxygen, which bubbles out into the reef water, keeping the shallow waters of the reef flat charged with oxygen when the tide is out and the waves aren't breaking. So although they're not very conspicuous, everywhere you look on the reef, there are seaweeds, each doing a very positive job in this whole game of protection, helping to provide this vast reef which protects the land way over there. They call it a barrier reef because it is just that, a great barrier between the open sea and the dry land, a barrier that runs down the full length of this tropical coast. And between the reef front and the dry land is a zone of protected water, a different environment in which the sands and the silts can settle out, providing a habitat in which the seaweeds cannot find a place to hold fast.
But in nature, nothing goes to waste, and those sands and silts are the home of another group of plants, the seagrasses. Plants which, like the mangroves, are divided into stem, leaf and roots, and it's those roots which bind the sands together, providing this underwater lawn, behind which some of the richest mangrove forests in the world raise their straight trunks up to the tropical sun. Way down south in the land of Brisbane there were only 6 sorts of mangroves. Here on the Daintree River there are 30 plus mangroves, members of at least 15 different plant families, each with their green, almost fleshy leaves, built-in tolerant to salt water, and some having those seeds which start to germinate while still on the parent plant, each one fitted to the special rigours of life between these tropical tides.
And now the third, and I reckon the weirdest of all the adaptations of the mangroves, their roots. Yeah, and they are roots even though they start way above the ground, and I can prove it. Because on the end of each one, there's a little dark cap. Now, there's a super one. Now, all true roots have a root cap, and I should, be able to get it off. You see, and it's there to protect the delicate growing tip as it grows down normally through the abrasive soil. But here in the air of the mangrove swamp, it protects those same tissues from drying out. So I'll put it back, let it carry on growing.
But most conspicuous of all is this jumbled roller coaster world made up of prop roots, which loop their way through the air, spawning off lesser roots as they go, which follow their parents' example. Each one is well supplied with lenticels, breathing pores which feed oxygen-rich air direct to the living tissues within.
Here, further inland, the conditions for mangrove growth are almost perfect, and they're springing up to 30 metres plus, which causes an enormous problem of weight, which has got to be borne by the roots. Just look at the roots. Enough to make any Boy Scout really jealous. The knobbliest knees in the world. The root comes out of the ground and then produces this great mass and then tucks itself back down again. And all those breathing pores, the lenticels, are there on the knobble. Perfect, keeping the roots down below supplied with the oxygen they need.
When the tide is out, it's hard to believe that these extensive forests are growing within the grip of the sea. Yes, these are forests between the tides. The giant trees of the next zone are each supported by a mass of plank buttress roots which run across the surface before diving down into the oxygenated mud. Masses of breathing pores along the top of each sinuous plank keep the roots well supplied with the oxygen they need. But when it comes to oxygen supply, it is in the final zone of mangroves that the weirdest of all the root adaptations are to be found.
I'm afraid the tide's caught me up. But there they are now. We've had roots which started way above the ground and then grew down, and other ones which ran along the top. But here's one that hasn't even heard of the rule of the root of going down towards the force of gravity. It turns down and grows in exactly the opposite direction. Now these are the giant spire breathing roots of the mangrove, and they're a great mass of rather spongy tissue covered with breathing pores. But of course, they're only half the story, because although they may be able to keep the underground parts supplied with the oxygen they need, what about all the minerals which are needed for plant growth? And to see that, we've got to find a bit of erosion. Now, that's the normal level of the mud, and here beside the creek it's been eroded away, revealing all. Now, the great main mass of roots growing out along the surface, and then the new spire breathing roots come up, and they prove their roots because each one has got the little root cap on the tip. They are the oxygenators, but then you see this great mass of small feeding roots growing out just in the surface silts, which every year are replenished as floodwaters come down the river, and of course replenished on every turn of the tide. And in that silt are all the minerals, all the nutrients that any self-respecting plant could want. No wonder the mangroves, or to give them their proper name, the tidal forest, are amongst the most productive living systems on Earth.
Each of the zones of this rich forest form the home of many thousands of creatures, the majority of which are very small. They take no notice of the beauty of the mangrove flowers, nor the weird shapes of their fruits. This is the closest insects ever get to living within the grip of the sea. The weaver ants building their nests by sewing mangrove leaves together. This little snail feeds on those same leaves, for he carries his home safe on his back. These and many more find safe sites for their own particular way of life within the tangled world of the mangroves.
Together we've travelled a long, long way since I said back on Bondi Beach that the Australian coast wasn't just white water and vital statistics. But perhaps I was wrong, because of course the white water is still with us, only thanks to those two great barriers, the barrier reef and then great fringe of the mangrove forest, the pounding waves where they should be, way out to sea. And here we're in gentle, protected waters. And of course the vital statistics of those two great living communities, about which we're only just beginning to learn something, are just as important to the life of this great country as her balance of payments.
What's she doing?
Do you, Scott Summers, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?
Warmed up America in preparation.
Minke whales are fighting to survive, and it's a losing battle. Norway and Japan are defying the international moratorium on whaling, and this year, Norway alone will kill 301 whales. But these minkies won't go meekly, not if Captain Paul Watson has his way. This Canadian is a self-styled eco-terrorist who has already sunk 8 whaling ships, and he says that he'll stop these Norwegian whalers by fair means or foul.
Sea shepherd, sea shepherd.
To many people, Paul Watson is simply a dangerous criminal, a pirate on the high seas. To others, he's a hero, someone who just does what the politicians haven't got the guts to do. Captain Paul Watson leads possibly the most violent and radical green movement in the world.
You sink ships. We sink outlaw pirate whaling vessels, ships that are operating in violation of international law.
He calls himself and his organization the Sea Shepherd, and his aim is to stop whaling, whatever the cost. There are no ifs and no buts with this man. He simply searches out his enemy and rams them.
I think that I have become probably the world's most experienced rammer of vessels as a result.
And those flags on the funnel, they're your trophies in a sense?
Those aren't, they don't signify the vessels we ram, but the vessels that we have sunk.
And the whalers are far from safe in port. There, Watson and his crew of commandos turn saboteurs. These are 2 of his trophies in a harbour in Iceland.
How many have you sunk?
2 in Iceland, 2 in Spain, 1 in Portugal, and 2 in Norway, plus 1 drift netter in Taiwan. Plus, we got the South African government to sink 2 seas, sink 2 of them down in South Africa. In addition, we rammed another 8 drift netters and whalers.
This month, Captain Watson is prowling, or as he puts it, patrolling the North Sea between Scotland and Norway. Green organisations from around the world are helping to bankroll his mission to commit capital crimes by ramming whaling vessels.
That's a pretty serious thing to do, isn't it?
Well, it's a pretty serious thing to do, to be killing whales in violation of international law. And when governments refuse to uphold those regulations because of trade concessions or whatever, or just turn a blind eye to it, somebody's got to do something. I think we're answerable to future generations, and that's why we do what we do.
The Norwegian whalers, and there are less than 200 of them on about 50 ships, live now as they have for years, tucked away in the beautiful villages amongst the famous fjords. This town, Reina, the centre for whaling, is in the Lofoten Islands. It's really quite magnificent, tranquil and at peace. And it's not such a harsh environment either. I mean, this is 200 kilometres inside the Arctic Circle. And for the moment, this is appropriate enough dress. It's just on midnight, and you really need these to be comfortable. Beautiful as it be, though, if Paul Watson and the rest of the world have their way and the whaling ban is enforced, then this place must go under. Since Viking
We can offer something new for your hair.
Russell has had some of his finest moments with director John Carpenter. They first teamed up for Elvis in 1979, with Kurt getting an Emmy nomination for playing the King. But they really went to town when Russell played a twisted hero named Snake in Escape from New York. And after all these years, you're about to find out there is more to the story.
You always were smart, Harold.
Just one thing right now. Don't call me Harold.
1981's Escape from New York saw Kurt Russell forced to save the President of the United States after he crash-landed in Manhattan. The twist, it's set in 1997, and the city has become a maximum security penitentiary. Today, the film's become a cult classic, and director John Carpenter can't believe it.
Yeah, kind of surprised. I think maybe it's because it has a grain of truth to it, about the crime rate, and about New York sort of does resemble a prison at times.
Now Carpenter has recut the film, adding more to the movie, setting up why Russell's character, Snake Plissken, has to escape from New York.
The movie started with inside a bank, a futuristic bank with robots moving along. There are people gathering money, and the bank is robbed by what looks like a maintenance man. It turns out to be Snake Plissken. And he runs down a corridor and up through the desert and into a subway station. He finally takes off his maintenance uniform, and his accomplice is there. He's hot wiring the subway train that runs basically from Florida all the way to San Francisco, underground. And very quickly, we learn that these two guys are bank robbers on a big scale, and they manage to commandeer the subway train and get inside. And they ride all the way to San Francisco, thinking, of course, that they've made it and that they're going to get away with it. However, waiting for them at the other end of the line is the United States police force, and they kill Snake's accomplice, and they capture Snake, and that's the reason that we find him in the prison in New York.
John Carpenter borrowed the name Snake Plissken from a friend, and like Kurt in the movie, the real Snake had a snake tattooed on his stomach. Hey, Snake, if you're out there, we'd love to hear from you.